The content of the course. We'll just review it very quickly. The introduction to journalism theories, framework for thinking about news, functions of the mass media. We want the definitions of news, public opinion, news as a form of knowledge, news as a purposive behavior. There's only 8 topics here, so they don't relate yet to the weeks 1 through 15. Topic 3, selecting the news, gatekeeping in traditional media, gatekeeping in the new media environment. This is from the perspective of the editors, and particularly editors within the news media. Number 4 is news as a workplace product, the social control of the newsroom and news organization and journalistic routines. I talked just a little bit about that, or I will talk a little bit about that later in this video, towards the end of it. Social control in the newsroom. I just said that. Number 5 is telling news as familiar story, routine, non-routine news. So there's some research on these topics that we can talk about, and also just discuss my experience in the newsroom and in the news business, which may or may not relate exactly to your research, but it may give you some perspectives that you might not otherwise have. Number 6 is sources of news. This is really important. There's research already on for example, I'll be talking about probably next week that in America, most of the major media typically use more liberal sources than conservative sources when looking at it politically. And politics, for some reason, is overlapping into science and culture and everything else right now. Everything being politicized, it seems like. And so how you choose your sources is an important subject. Sources as framing forces. So again, indeed, that's what I was just kind of talking about. If you choose mostly sources from one side of a discussion, they're going to help frame your story, whether you intentionally do it or not. They will. Objectivity. They don't put the word here, fairness. When we were in my American training in journalism, we talked a lot about objectivity and fairness, and we realized that objectivity is almost impossible. Fairness is more achievable. For example, in the selection of sources, you should be able to be fair in that. Objectivity and professionalism. And the last subject is ideology in news. News as a social power, journalists as interpretive communities. This is an area that concerns me right now, is that ideology is seeping into the news business more and more, and to some degree overwhelming all these other subjects. It's influencing gatekeeping, it's influencing source selection, it's influencing objectivity, it's influencing whether you can really call news knowledge anymore. And if news is a purposive behavior and it's mixed with ideology, then news is a purposive behavior plus an ideological, and that behavior is ideological, then it's no longer news, that's propaganda. And I fear more and more of our news is becoming propaganda. So anyway, those are some things that we'll be talking about during the semester, and I'll be adding my own perspectives and own topics as we go along. Let me go to my PowerPoint, because it does kind of feed into the PowerPoint I did create. And so I phrased this is kind of an overview of the things that are occurring to me as I think about this class. And so I want to cover a lot of different things, not in a lot of depth today, but somewhat shallowly. Things to help make you think. For those that have not been in a class of mine, by the way, that is my name. And most people around here call me Dr. Ken. Ken is actually my first name, but as I work overseas and around the world, sometimes people have trouble pronouncing Harvey or remembering Harvey, but most everybody knows Ken and Barbie, and so just take off the Barbie, and that's me. And I don't really care if you put the doctor in front of it or the prof in front of it. I consider myself more of a professional than a professor, although I've been a professor for 20 years or so. Um, but I still align myself more with the profession than academia. I find myself frequently in um, what's the right word, in conflict with academia. For example, when I first started my career, maybe just give you a little bit of background. Um, when I was doing my bachelor's degree, I was active in student publications. We had at the university I was at, we had a daily newspaper, student newspaper that was very successful. In fact, our we sold advertising, and our advertising salespeople were actually making. We kind of got in trouble because our student advertising salespeople were making higher salaries than our professors were, because our newspaper was so well read and had such a strong audience for a kind of a relatively small community with a big university. And we as a news staff were pretty influential in the community. We had the daily newspaper. I worked on that. We had a daily magazine, I mean, a weekly magazine. I worked on that. And then I was the editor of our yearbook, sometimes called an annual. That is a book about yay thick, kind of detailing everything that happened during the year, lots of photos of students and so forth. I did that for 2 years. But nonetheless, I was kind of thinking about going into education right away. And I did not actually, um, even though I had, well, in America, the typical graduation rate is you take 4 years to graduate. You don't go during the summer typically. I had taken 1 year at at a different university, and then I went to Central America for 2 years on a service mission, and that was kind of enlightening to me, a life changing experience for me. And then I came back, and I felt like I wanted to kind of crash through the university, but at the same time, I wanted to learn just as much as I could. And so at our university, once you paid for, I think it's like 12 credits, everything above that was free. So I was taking like 20 credits most of the time. So I could take as many courses as I could. And I had lots of interest in lots of things. I was interested in political science. I was interested in education. I was obviously interested in journalism, and lots of other things. And so um, when I was, but so after 2 years of going year round, I never took any time off, like you guys don't here. I already had 15 credits or so more than I needed to graduate, but I hadn't taken all the credits I had to take. And in America, they didn't kick us out just because we had more credits. They didn't dictate what we took, and they didn't care if we kept going. And so I had taken a lot of courses, but I had not gotten my teaching certificate yet. So I was still planning to take at least one more semester, and maybe more than that, and maybe go straight on to my master's degree. But then one day while I was working on the student yearbook, one of my professors came in and said, Ken, I have a friend who's starting a new newspaper all the way across the country in Tampa, Florida. It's a large circulation weekly, and he's asked me to find him somebody that I think could be an editor of a newspaper right out of college, and I'm asking you to go across the country and be the editor. So since I hadn't actually completed all the courses, I ended up having to um, take a correspondence course. Luckily, they had that available. I had to crash through that in a month, and then they allowed us to challenge courses. That is, take the final exam without going to class. And so I challenged a course, and I went through the book. It was something I knew quite well, politics and government, and so I did that and graduated before I wanted to, before I thought I was going to. Let me put it that way. And went across the country to take over this large circulation newspaper, 120,000 circulation in a big city. And that I had never lived in a big city, so that was a whole new experience by itself. I had grown up on a farm, um, and even the college I went to was in a small city. And so going to a big and growing city like Tampa, Florida, was in itself quite an experience, let alone becoming the editor of a newspaper. So I did that for a couple of years and had some experiences I'm sure I'll share as we go along that were very valuable to my future. And then I had a disagreement, not an argument really, but my boss was making some decisions that I thought were going to destroy the newspaper, and I didn't want to go down with the sinking ship. And so I told him that. I explained to him what the decisions you're making are poorly based. I'll stay around for, I think I gave him a 3 months notice, so it's not like I was stomped out of the place. I'll give you 3 months to replace me, but in 3 months I'm leaving. And in those 3 months, of course, that also gave me time to figure out what am I going to do next. The possibility was going back for my master's, but then I decided to try to buy my own publishing company. And I didn't have a lot of money, but I asked my dad over the phone, long distance, 4,000 miles away, to go ask this guy, this aging publisher, if he was interested in selling his newspaper and his book publishing company. And lo and behold, he was just going to start trying to sell it. And I made him an offer of nothing down and a few $100s a month, and he accepted it. And so at the age of 25, I became a newspaper publisher as well as editor and reporter and everything else. I had to learn darkroom work in those days. We didn't have digital photography yet. That was in 1975 when I bought that newspaper. My career started a long time ago, 1973. We didn't have computers yet. There were some real kind of toys that they called computers, but they weren't really anything like we know of today. So I kind of there were some very expensive computers that newspapers did have to use. They again, whether you call them computers, I'm not sure you would. Big machines they had to use to produce, but anyway, it was after a couple of years of that, I was able to sell that newspaper for a nice profit and went back to get my master's degree. And suddenly I was very scared to go back. I didn't, I'd been out of college for by then about 5 years. And I thought, gee, all these other people are going straight through for their master's. They're used to this routine. I now have a family. I had, I got, at that time, two children, and I think a third one on the way at that point. I'm going to have other distractions. How am I going to do? But it turned out I was pretty good at it. And the professors liked the idea of having somebody more mature. And so they started coming to me to co-author research with them. And so in our area in journalism, the average professor in America publishes fewer than 4 books or at least top tier journal articles in their entire career. It is not a high academically publishing area. They publish obviously a lot journalistically, but they don't publish a lot academically. And so anyway, by the time I finished my master's degree, I already had 4 national, top tier journal articles published. So the background for that is just to kind of give you my thinking. I'd already been a professional. The professors were already seeking my help. In fact, some of the things I was doing had them quite amazed. that was a shock to me that they would be amazed at me. But and so much so that I was within 4 months, they gave me this annual award for being the top graduate student, even though I'd only been there for 4 months. I thought, well, that's kind of unusual. But I was already working with professors, and I guess they saw something in that. From that background, because I was going in as a professional, I've always looked even at my academic research from a professional's perspective. Some of the first research I had published was based on surveys of future employers of our students, the executives of media, and well, particularly media at that time. Later, I started surveying also PR executives and asking them what are the universities doing well and what are they not doing well. And so I really concentrated on that. I think 3 of my articles were published on that topic. I found that both magazine editors and newspaper editors were not happy with the quality of American journalism graduates. Over the years, I found that the universities don't even care. 10 years ago, well, 9 years ago, after 30 years after my first publications, I used some of the same instruments, same surveys, and with a response of nearly 800 executives, found that they still didn't like what was going on in universities. They still had the very same complaints, and the universities had done nothing about it. And so that's where I find my conflict with universities, is that I know that they're not satisfying the future employers of their students, at least not in America. And I know they're not doing anything to do it, to correct that. And so that kind of makes me mad as a professional myself, considering myself that instead of a professor. I kind of lock horns with them sometimes. So in most of my own research, I've looked at it from that perspective. I did another one of my studies that I had published just while I was doing my master's degree, was the first ever study of what we now would call viral news, or at least viral. Well, it wasn't the first study of viral news, but the first one of viral news that was not negative. Let me put it that way, which is common nowadays. Viral messages through the internet now are very common, positive ones as well as negative ones. But at that point, the only negative viral communications they had ever studied was things like assassinations. And assassinations, the information about an assassination would go through society in one day, would reach like somewhere between 95 and 100% of the people would know about a major assassination like John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King, those sorts of people. Everybody would know about it. How do you suppose they learned about it? Through the media? How does news like that get to almost every person in the country that quickly? What do you think? Just guessing. Would they get it through the media? Or they would get it from somebody, like from other people? Other people. Most of it came from other people. Their studies of good news was also kind of boring news, like Alaska becoming a state, even Russians launching Sputnik. All that sort of news would reach maybe 25% of the people in the country, and almost all of them would hear through the media. Nobody was talking about that stuff. So in other words, that's why it wasn't viral. There was no viral. They had never studied viral communications that was positive. You had to take something shocking. In fact, that was the name of our. We referred to that in our headline. Our title was. I don't remember exactly what it said, but basically shocking. It referred to shocking good news. and it was the first study of shocking good news, which now actually has a lot of application nowadays. I mean, research has gone way beyond what we did in 1978, but it took me a while to actually realize the significance of what we did, because it didn't really become significant, in a sense, until the digital age. Now it's extremely, in fact, that word shocking that we used in our headline in 1978 is exactly the word that professional marketers use when they're trying to create viral marketing. It has to be shocking. Um, so anyway, even that study was had practical application, maybe more now than it did in 1978. Um, Later on, I've done a lot of studies. In fact, I went into excuse me. After I got my master's, I immediately became an assistant professor of journalism in the New York system at age 30. And that was a great experience. I continued my research, wrote a book, and did other stuff that professors do. And then I went back to the industry. Um, while I was an editor at a daily newspaper, I was also running the journalism program for a small local college. And so that returned me to academia, but we didn't have any requirement to do any research during that time. It was a great experience, but not research. And then it was another more than, let me see, count that here. Well, it was about 25 years later when I decided to go back into academia. Having a lot of experience at that point, not just in publishing, but also in marketing and public relations. So it was in 2008 when I finally finished my PhD and took my next full-time teaching job in Kazakhstan. But in between there, I did do some other research towards the profession. But when I reached Kazakhstan in 2008, things were dramatically changing at that point. Before I didn't really end my professional career, but before I put it on the back burner, let me put it that way, I had started a newspaper that was weekly in print and daily online. This was before that trend actually got going, and it was a little bit ahead of its time, and we made some mistakes in a number of things, particularly in HR, human resources, a bad mistake there. And so we ended up shutting that down after a couple of years, but it was our first venture in trying to catch the latest trends. And we were competing against the daily newspaper at that point. And that was it was a daily newspaper aligned with the largest newspaper chain in America. So it was not a small foe. It was a very powerful foe that we were trying to take on, and that made it more difficult, obviously. But then by 2008, of course, about the time I headed to Kazakhstan, like 1 month after I arrived in Kazakhstan, we suddenly had the recession, the Great Recession of 2008. And the very next month, in November 2008, we had a very startling election of Barack Obama, who, despite not really reflecting the values of most Americans, used social media and internet marketing to win an election in a very shocking way, because by then in 2008 most marketers didn't really take the internet very seriously, although the advertising were already starting to move to the internet to some degree, but it really started moving as of 2008, partly because internet advertising is so much cheaper. And so suddenly the revenue base of American media was collapsing. In fact, by 2015 or 2016, I guess it was, American newspapers had lost 2/3 of their advertising. They were dying and dying fast. They had in 2000 and I have some statistics. I'm not sure if they're in this PowerPoint or not, but in 2000, around 2004, about 2% of their revenue was coming from online advertising. And by 2014 or 15, they'd only raised it to 3%. So they had no idea how to compete with online media, not a clue. In fact, even saying 3% is probably an exaggeration because they had already lost 2/3 of their advertising. So if they lost 2/3 of their print advertising, then 2% when they had lots of print advertising was probably more than 3%. But when they didn't have any advertising, didn't have much print advertising, so they really had no clue how to compete with online advertising. Thus, I started doing a lot of research in online marketing. I still consider myself a journalist, but I wanted to understand what the heck was going on. In lots of research, from my perspective as a professional, a lot of our research is irrelevant to the industry, and that's not just my opinion. It's the opinion of the newspaper executives. They think research in our area is totally irrelevant to the real world. It isn't totally, but largely it is. And one of the reasons why it is irrelevant is the way it began. I know in some of your classes you've talked about research in communications. Back in the 1930s, when it first began, when mass media research began. Of course, mass media wasn't very old in the 1930s. The TV was only invented, I think, in 1928. There were no networks. Nobody was actually producing any programming with TV. Radio was coming on strong. There were enough radio stations that in 1928 in America they had to set up what now is called the Federal Communications Commission to try to regulate, because radios were overlapping each other's signals, and so you weren't hearing anything. You're hearing conflicting messages from different radio stations. So the FCC was challenged or given the mandate to straighten that out so that broadcasting would make some sense. Of course, the free press was going very strong, going all the way back to the beginning of the United States in 1776, and was one of the reasons why it broke off from Britain when they felt like their free press was being impeded by the British government. So the roots of free press were beginning already in 1776. The strongest broadcast media developed in America, again, starting, you probably have to say the 1920s for radio, 1950s for TV. And of course, that's where the internet was born as well. Anyway, going back to the roots of research then, back in the 1930s, the common thinking was that radio was so influential. Everybody had a radio. There were only, at that point, maybe 3 networks. There were a lot of local radio stations, but there were some networks starting to develop at that point already. And so the networks had a lot of influence, and they thought they were kind of afraid they had too much influence. Because they kind of had the perspective of the human being as, the radio station just pouring all this propaganda into people's heads, and that they were just accepting all of it openly and vigorously, and being kind of brainwashed by whoever controlled radio. They found out during the 1930s research that wasn't true. That's when they started talking about, you might remember from other classes, the two-step process, or the impact of influencers, or those who would kind of relay news and information, but with their own analysis to those around them, those who respected them. And so we found out that it was not just a direct open head, pour in influence. And so that was done by, I think that research was, I can't remember now whether it's sociologist or psychologist. But all of that research, all the early research was done by those. There was no such thing as a journalism program at the universities. And so research began with the research of psychologists and sociologists. That research is very interesting, and it does a lot in helping us as academics understand what's going on. It doesn't do much for news executives. A little bit maybe, especially in this day and age, it might be important for them to understand how people deal with their news, but not much. They don't consider it seriously. In my research, I've asked them questions that reflect on that, and they hate theory classes. They would probably hate this class, and they hate most of the kind of the overview courses you've been required to take here. They hate those. They don't think you're getting anything out of them, which is, by the way, one reason why I haven't created it yet, but you will see that I will want you to do some practical work in learning about the impractical, so to speak. We'll learn about the theories, but I want you to practice your practical skills while you're learning about impractical information. And not all is impractical. In fact, I challenge you to find practical. That's, as I said, that's where I've transitioned to more than ever since I came back into academia in 2008. Is I want to approach it more like a business professor. I want to see how to save traditional media, how to compete with online media, how to compete within online media. I want to know. That's why I'm looking from the business side as a former publisher. Is I'm looking at from a different perspective. Most research is from the sociological or psychological perspective. That, like I said, most professionals don't find of value. So I'm kind of reoriented myself in looking more at the business side of the business of communications. Anyway, yeah, I've got lots of experience. A lot of it's overlapping. I am not 100 years old, but I'm getting close. I'll be turning 70 in a couple of months. So I've been around for a long time. And I hope that will be of value to you, because I will put kind of what I'm leading up to this point, or trying to explain, is I'm going to try to put a practical perspective on most of the things we talk about. Even if the executives don't think there is a practical application, I'm going to try to put a practical application to it, because many of you will go into the real world practice of this business. I have even a disagreement that you should even be working on theses unless you plan to go on to a master's degree. I see a professional portfolio as being of more use to those of you who do not plan to go on to a master's degree. And at KeyMep, we were facing the same question. We were being pushed by the Ministry of Education there to start bachelor theses. And I was arguing, how can we get them to accept a professional portfolio in place of a thesis? When I left, nobody had made any headway with that. But that's another area where I conflict with academia, because ultimately I think we make two sets of people promises as educators at a university, I think. And this has been my argument for now going close to 40 years. The first set of people we make a promise to is to you, the students. And
We may not put it in writing. In fact, we can't. Nobody would dare. There is one university I heard recently that is, but it's rare. In fact, I would like to be part of a university that would. But um, that promise that I think we make to you is that if you come and you work hard and you study and you get good grades, you're going to be able to go out and get a good job. Most people come and think that's one of the promises we're giving them. Like I said, it's not in writing. Otherwise, you could sue us. Many of you could sue us because you may not go out and get a good job. Um, and that's what frustrates me when I find that the universities in America have not adapted to the needs of the industry as demonstrated through my research. They're not adapting at all. They don't care, and that drives me crazy. The other group that I think we make a promise to are the employers. We say if you hire our students, who we've trained so carefully, that they're going to be able to come to your job and they're going to be able to get in there and do a great job for you. And they could also sue us if we put that into writing. And that's what they're revealing in my research is they don't think the typical graduate of a university can do a good job because universities have not properly prepared them. So while I think those are promises a university makes, universities don't think they're making those promises. And that's where, as a person who thinks of myself more as a professional, that greatly frustrates me. So when I take over a course like this that is more theoretical, I try to make it as practical as possible because I think I owe it to you and I owe it to the industry, to your future employers to do that. So we'll talk about that in our next class, but I'm just warning you, I'm going to do my best to put some practical spin on this course. Just some of the stuff I have done. This was actually my last newspaper. It was, again, my goal was to do it monthly in print and daily online. And if I had done it my way, I probably wouldn't be here, actually. But a very bad employee basically lied to us and talked us into going weekly, which was not the best way for what we're doing because we were trying to build a strong online presence. And instead, we end up wasting a lot of money unnecessarily in going weekly instead of monthly. As you see, kind of a news magazine approach to it. I also, at that time, was publishing this entertainment entertainment magazine, and that's still going strong. I had an ownership interest in it, and then I kind of lost that um, because of my inactivity in the business. But I'm thinking about buying back into it to use that partly for experimental purposes. I want to go do some things on the business side to see if I can do some, from all this studying I've been doing, all this research I've been doing on the marketing and business side, I want to go apply it in the real world, and this would be a good place to go is get back involved with this and try to help them build their revenues. We'll see if I do that or not. Online, this is an online blog I have um, because I'm frustrated with biased. I have my own biases, and full biases, my own biases, but because I have newsfeed, what I consider the liberal media on the left of my website, and newsfeed from the conservative media on the right. People who come to my blog can read the news from both sides, and I can tell them which is right, but whatever. We all have our biases. I've continued my book publishing while being a professor back about 10 years ago. So a Peace Corps worker in America came to me and she wanted to have a conference for non-government organizations. In America, we call them nonprofit organizations, and wanted to help tell their story. So she wanted me to help publish a book. And I listened to her arguments, her reasons why she wanted to do it. And I said, Kristen, I'll help you, but not if you want to do it only 1 year. I know you're going to go home. You're a Peace Corps volunteer. I'm going to stay here, but I want us to take the approach that this is going to go on forever. But I think it's too important to make it only 1 year project. And so this is still going on now. I still support them from here. I made one of their welcome me speeches at their latest conference in June. We've now published, I think, at least 10 books, and I continue to support that. Write a chapter for most of them, sometimes a couple of chapters. Anyway, so I'm still involved in publishing from that perspective, and also with just supporting good projects. That's in that first year we had only like a $10,000 grant, and now they have more. They've been given grants of more than $10 million, or about $10 million, and it now covers all of Central Asia from Kazakhstan to Azerbaijan, and about 8 different countries through there, and provides online support, online education, books, like we're still publishing the book, conferences, and so forth. This is another site I created. I call it online TV channel. It's not really, but it's kind of organized video, embedded video. And I haven't really updated it for quite a while, but I something else that I'm still thinking about reactivating, getting. I see some potential for it commercially and experimentally for research. But anyway, what I call a online TV channel. Actually, it started when I went to a conference, and the question there was, what's the future of what we call public TV? Public TV is typically non-political, a lot of cultural, a lot of might have news, but it's supposed to be non-political. It's frequently funded through donations, individual donations, corporate donations. Some governments provide support. In America, there's government support for it. Some don't. But it's a way of, actually, the main purpose of public TV is to provide programming that commercial TV won't provide. In other words, it's programming that might not have such a big audience that it would be worthwhile for people to pay advertising for. And so again, cultural things, stuff like that, discussions, in-depth political discussions, but in-depth ones, things like that. And so they asked me to be on a panel about how to save public TV. And I said, stop broadcasting and go online. Do this. And so this actually came out of that to demonstrate how public TV could go online and be better than it is in broadcast format. Anyway, so that's another one of my websites. This was kind of a combination of PR and publishing. I was publishing this bilingual publication for the state of Washington, so that makes it really PR, because I was doing it for one client. But it was about education, the education of migrant students specifically. They're the most challenged students in American education because they frequently don't speak English. Their families migrate by definition. They might go from one school to another school to another school to another school in a year. Those schools do not have the same curriculum, and so whether they even get credit for what they were studying in the other school is questionable, and half of them drop out. Half of them drop out before they graduate because it's just hopeless. And so my job was to put together this quarterly publication about the best practices in migrant education, migrant and bilingual education. And so that was kind of a mixture of academia and professionalism. Got into marketing. This was a publication for engineering consulting firm that I worked for, and that we had to do books, sometimes books that thick, explaining why we were the best choice to do a $10 million project or something. So this was big ticket sales items, so to speak. Um, helping design a prison, for example, or a large school or a university or something like that. So it was worth a lot of money, and we had to prepare a lot of detailed information about, again, why we were the best choice to do that. And so we actually published books to explain to them, and that was a good experience for me too. Got me into more in the marketing area. And I did political campaigning, including my own over in the left. And this was also kind of avant-garde, you might say. Today, the number one, some of you have taken other courses, so you might have remember the answer to this. Well, this is a test, and those of you who took my history course, what is the number one trending type of advertising on the internet right now? Display advertising. Anybody remember? Oh boy, I will go back and change your grade. It's called native advertising. What's native advertising? What is it? Again, I'm not sure they teach in the business department here. They should, but it is the number one. Like I say, they're predicting by 2021 that native advertising will make up about 75% of all online display advertising. Display, probably not the right word, but nowadays, because it doesn't, that's a word that came from traditional marketing and isn't quite the same in online marketing. But in online, they basically have two types of advertising. One is display, and one is search. Search meaning what you will see when you do a search on Google or one of the other search engines. Search advertising, what you see in other websites would be display advertising. So basically, just those two types. And the one that they think is going to represent 75% of all display advertising is native advertising, which is made to look like the surrounding content. So when you go to Facebook and you look, down the timeline, when you see a post that says sponsored, that's paid content. That is native advertising. Everything else, organic, of course, is not paid. Even if I'm a business, I can put my content on my timeline, obviously, and they don't charge me for it. So that's not advertising, it's marketing. That's considered content marketing. So that's marketing, but it's not advertising because it's not paid for. So back in 1974, I ran a campaign for a mayoral candidate in Tampa, Florida. And this is this was in the daily newspaper there, I believe. And it was made to look like a news page. Not as well designed as we design nowadays. Design has evolved over the years, so I'm not necessarily real proud of the design. But it was actually better designed than most design in newspapers in those days, in 1973. But even the government official who oversaw elections, called this election supervisor, he read half of this page before he realized there was an ad. So that's kind of the point of native advertising, is to fool people a little bit, even though they said it down here, ad and pay for by at the top of each column it says pay for advertisement and pay for advertisement. So it says it's an ad, but by the very nature of native advertising, you are trying to fool people, which brings up ethical questions, by the way. But it has become, even the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal, who used to condemn native advertising, are now selling native advertising because they need the money. And so that's another trend right now. Of course, this is in a traditional medium. It brought this candidate up from number 8 out of 8 candidates running for mayor of Tampa. In 1 month, I brought him from number 8 to number 2, which allowed him then to go into the next step of the election, the general election. And the general election, he won over 60% of the precincts using native advertising. Anyway, more on the business side of my research and other books that I've co-authored. Okay. Now I want to get to our real subject then. I want to give kind of an overview of some of the of journalism and communications overall. My intention is to keep going for about another 20 minutes and give you a break. If you need to go, go. But other than that, I'll give you a 10-minute break in about 20 minutes. Some of you have seen this slide before. It's the way I perceive our brains to work. And this is not my own thinking, actually. Maybe it is in the sense that I compare it to this erector set. When I was a kid in the 1950s, this was extremely popular. It was kind of the 1950s version of Legos. And what you did is you took all these strips of metal and other pieces, and you would take a little bolt and a little nut, and you'd screw all these pieces together. So rather than just piecing them together like Legos, some were short, some were long. You had motors in case you want to do something that actually moved, like the Ferris wheel over there. But you'd bolt all these pieces together and make stuff. So I think I missed some material here in my discussion, so I'll add a few thoughts. Maybe you have to do some other editing. But anyway, I wanted to look up and discuss Thomas Kuhn with Kuhn, who wrote a famous book on scientific revolutions that was published in 1962, and yet is still referred to on a regular basis because it was such important insights, such important research and such important insights about how revolutions take place, and it really reflects on how we think. And so, again, referring to this erector set that I grew up with, he noted that almost every scientific revolution, this would include things like, when before, people thought the world was flat, and then they realized it was round, and they thought that the sun rotated around the earth, and of course the earth later that the earth rotates around the sun, and so forth. And these concepts required a revolution, and those who led the revolution sometimes were put into jail for doing so, because the people who controlled the governments did not like their screwing around with their conceptual frameworks. And so it usually was, according to Kuhn, like I said, almost always a young person who would lead the revolution. And this reflects back then on this erector set vision of what our conceptual framework is like, is that as we get older and as we study more, as we piece together in our mind all the concepts that we learn, our conceptual framework becomes more and more rigid, just like the Eiffel Tower here was my example. As we make hook up pieces crossways from one of the long arms of the erector set to the other, then it becomes difficult to change any one part of it. If you give it a push, it no longer wobbles, it tips over all in one piece. It's all or nothing. And so consequently, because we don't like our conceptual framework toppled over, we talked in class about cognitive dissonance, and I'm not sure whether I got that in the recording or not, but anyway, cognitive dissonance is this resistance to having our conceptual framework threatened, I guess you could say. That as some new concept comes in, it's kind of like a long piece of this erector set that just doesn't fit anymore. Everything's been put together, and
suddenly there's no place to put this other piece. It's like there's no place to put another concept. And so Kuhn called those things that we reject, that we just simply don't fit into our conceptual framework anymore. And we reject them outright because we consider them nonsense. Those things that fit into our conceptual framework make sense. Those things that don't fit into our conceptual framework are nonsense. And so his ideas have been important and are important in understanding how we think, and how we need to some degree, protect ourselves and protect, as journalists, protect our organizations from becoming too rigid and from failing to consider new ideas that no longer, that threaten our way of thinking. And we need to resist. We need to resist cognitive dissonance, which is itself resistance. So, I mean, cognitive dissonance is resistance. We need to resist the resistance, so to speak, in order to be able to keep looking at new ideas and understanding new concepts and seeing things from new perspectives.
And this one PowerPoint is probably about 3 weeks worth of lecture. But so I want to wrap up kind of talking about some of the psychological aspects of it, and how that relates to this here. We talked about a couple of concepts already that you may have studied elsewhere. Cognitive dissonance is basically our way of protecting our conceptual framework. Kuhn said that basically anything that we can't fit into our conceptual framework, we tend to throw out, and we call it nonsense. That's his scientific term. So it either makes sense or it makes no sense. If it makes no sense, it's nonsense. And so whatever we can't, again, the older we get, and even the smarter we are, we start making a very strong conceptual framework and start throwing away nonsense that doesn't fit into it. And that's kind of a dangerous thing to do. I see in America right now a lot of polarization that is very disturbing to me in our political, in the politics, the polarization of our society that I think could lead to increased violence because people absolutely do not understand each other. They come from different perspectives. Basically, those that support Trump are typically business people from small villages and communities, people who are, like a lot of farmers, business people like that. But basically, they're not necessarily corporate executives. There are corporate executives who are conservative. There's also corporate executives, like all the executives of the big media corporations, Google and Facebook, are all quite liberal. They see life very differently than the small business people. Like my brother owns an insurance company. He's very much a Trump supporter. I'll show you some statistics maybe next week to show you that as we get more into the challenges that face us within our profession, the liberals, what we call liberals, by the way, liberal and conservative mean different things in different societies. I'm a conservative in America, and I'm a liberal in Kazakhstan. I'm probably at least lean liberal in Malaysia, because the societies are very different. And I guess if I could redefine liberal, I might be called a liberal in America. But liberals in America become conservatives by if you actually defined it the way it was meant. You could argue that liberals in America are really conservatives, and conservatives are the liberals. I don't know. It gets complicated. But one thing that I've based mine on is free speech and freedom of expression, freedom of religion, those sorts of freedoms. In America, we have them, but they are actually in jeopardy from the liberals, not from the conservatives. Liberals like to accuse the conservatives of being anti-free speech, but it's on the campuses where the campuses are basically creating this, what they call, PC, politically correct, and they're telling us what we can say and what we can't say, and if we say something wrong, we're in trouble. I have a personal story on that, where some students came out in America, wanted to get me fired because I talked about my nephew, who I love very much, and I was actually talking about multiple intelligences. Anybody know about the theory of multiple intelligences? It's basically that there's, we tend to think of, these people are smart, these people aren't so smart, but there's so many different ways that our mind works that to think of people just in terms of what they do in school is not accurate. For example, my brother, I mentioned him, in school, he was sharpening his pencil and seeing if he could get him stick in the ceiling. He blew up the chemistry lab. He was always having fun with people, and his grades weren't very good. But he was socially intelligent. That's one type of intelligence that is not rewarded in the classroom, right? A teacher does not want somebody who's socially intelligent in his classroom because they're a troublemaker. They're talking all the time. They're having fun. They're laughing, whatever. But that is a type of intelligence, the type of intelligence that has made my brother a millionaire, worth a lot more money than I am, because he's socially intelligent. He knows how to work with people, how to influence people in ways that have made him rich. So who's smarter? He's worth about 10 million. I'm worth about 10 cents. So it depends. There's other types of intelligence. Music, for example, is a type of intelligence. You have the creator of this theory looked at it by looking at child prodigies, and you have 3-year-olds playing the piano like they've had 40 years of practice. You have children who can do calculus at 4 years old. You have these prodigies, and so this professor from Harvard thinks that those prodigies are indications of different parts of our brain, different types of intelligence that can exist in our brain that most of us haven't stimulated enough, or whatever. Maybe it's not as large in our brain as it is in somebody else's, but that all these types of intelligence must exist there. But each of us is stronger in one area or another. He thinks there's at least 8 types of intelligence, and maybe 12 or 13 types of intelligence. He's, having to guess a little bit since there's nobody to tell him what the right answer is. So he has his own theories. But I think you can see that. You can see the different. You see people like my brother. In fact, the average millionaire in America. They studied 700 millionaires in America. What do you suppose their average GPA was in high school? 2.9. They're not geniuses. They're millionaires. But they were probably thinking making their grand plans for becoming rich. I don't know what they were doing, but they were not sitting in class getting good grades. And so, are they stupid? No, I don't think so. It's, they're millionaires, and we're not, or at least most of us aren't. So, I do strongly agree with this idea of multiple intelligences. I don't know, like even the creator of the concept does not know how many intelligences there are. But I think there clearly are different intelligences. And I was talking about my nephew, who is, if you use a medical term, he is clinically retarded. That is, he has an IQ of about 60. He had some problems when he was born. He had some other problems after that. He is now 40-something years old. He does not know how to read or write. But you ask him about animals. He sits and he loves watching TV shows about animals and anything that relates to the animals. An example is my mom was watching a game show, and the question was, where is the Gobi Desert? And you may or may not be aware that Americans are very stupid in world geography. And so most people don't know where the Gobi Desert is in America. Anyway, so mom wasn't sure, and she turned to our IQ 60, her IQ 60 grandson, and said, "Where do you know, Aaron, where the Gobi Desert is?" So, oh yeah, that's in China, and they have this animal and this kind of animal, and they, all this sort of stuff. He lectured her for quite a few minutes about the Gobi Desert because that was important to him. He can't read, can't write, but he loves animals and he loves anything that relates to the animals, about where they live, their environment, and all this sort of stuff. He knows way more about that than I do. And later on, she asked his older brother, who's pretty smart. He thought it was in Africa. So he didn't know the Gobi Desert, but his 60 IQ brother did. My point was multiple intelligences, that something in his brain really clicks in when it relates somehow to animals and things like that, environment, stuff like that, even though he doesn't know how to read and write. He is clinically retarded. I use that word is a PC word in America, politically incorrect. You can't say that. You can't use the word retarded. And you shouldn't say it if you're trying to just make somebody feel bad. You retard, that's what we used to say when we were kids. That was one of the favorite words we'd use if we wanted to insult somebody. You're a retard. Okay, so yeah, that is politically, and that is offensive. That should not be used that way. I was talking about my nephew, who I love, and I was trying to use him as a good example of multiple intelligences, and these kids from Central Washington University want to get me fired over it. That's political. That's stupid PC, and that's the sort of thinking that's overtaken the universities in America. It's crazy ideas. Anyway, there's lots of examples of that. And so actually in America, in the universities, they actually have riots. If somebody who thinks like I do comes to campus, they will have a riot to stop him from talking. And so the people who are restricting free speech and press are on the liberal side, which, that's the conservatives are appalled by this, but that's what's happening in America right now. Obviously, in Kazakhstan, they do have quite a few restrictions on free press and free speech. It's a democracy, but not a real good one yet. And so I'm a very strong liberal by most definitions. I want more free speech, more free press, more free religion, etc. Anyway, wherever that was going to. Anyway, we have cognitive dissonance, selective exposure. We talked about that. Selective perception means you sometimes don't even perceive the things the same. Depending on your conceptual framework, you can see the very same thing that somebody else sees, and you see something totally different. You read the very same thing that somebody else reads. You read something totally different. There was a study done between newsreaders in the Palestine and those in Israel, Jews. And they gave them the same stories to read, the same newspaper stories to read. The Jews all thought that it was biased towards the Palestinians. And the Palestinians thought it was all biased towards the Jews. You can read the very same thing, perceive the very same thing, but not perceive the very same thing. That happens all the time. If I say the word dog, some of you will in your mind go, "Oh, that mean old dog that bit me when I was a kid." And others say, "Oh, let me pet it." From based on your experience, you envision a different dog. That sort of thing, magnify that a million times, and we respond to essentially every word somehow in a different way. We talk a different language because we perceive those words to mean different things. They mean different things to us. We see different things when we say those words. So selective perception, both not just in words, but even visually, we see things differently than somebody else because we're looking for something. You see what you're looking for in a sense. We already talked about the two-step theory, where you have opinion leaders in the society, and they tend to influence people more than the news does. And so that's one reason I'll go through some slides next week, but um, in the last 20 years, the media in America have always given much more positive coverage, according to a liberal university's special agency for content analysis. It wasn't by a conservative group. They've given typically twice as much positive news to the Democrats, the liberals in America, and half as many negative news stories. And it didn't matter who the candidates were. This was during presidential elections. It didn't matter who the candidates were. If they were liberal Democrats, they got twice as much positive coverage, half as much negative coverage than the Republican. It's much worse than that under Trump. He's getting 90% negative coverage from the mainstream media in America. 90%. Despite that, opinion leaders, now social media, other ways of communicating with people, the Republicans frequently win. The conservatives frequently win. It kind of goes back and forth, back and forth. So if the news media had as much control as they thought they did back in the 1930s, no conservative Republican would ever win. It would not be possible. When Obama beat McCain wasn't exactly a conservative, but really, in relation or compared to Obama, he was. McCain, because of the way Obama figured out how to use online marketing, he was able, and maybe because he was very charismatic and McCain wasn't particularly, but he got twice as much money to run his campaign as did McCain. He had over $800 million to run his campaign. Obama did. McCain had, like I said, had 400 million something. And McCain would have set the record for the most money ever, except for Obama. McCain did more fundraising than any other candidate for president ever in the history of America, and Obama had twice as much money. And yet Obama only beat him by about 4 percentage points, which means McCain just had to flip, just a few people, relatively few people, comparatively in population percentage of people, to have won that election with half as much money and half as much good news coverage. He was almost exactly half as much positive news and twice as much negative news as Obama. And yet he was a war hero. But and in fact, now he just died recently, and all the news that gave him this bad publicity 10 years ago was saying how wonderful he was because he hated Trump. So now he's wonderful. Anyway, so definitely the two-step theory, we see a lot of good things. And social influence is another thing. When I was doing my master's thesis, I created a diagram, something like this. It's not filled out the way I did in my thesis, but I wanted to look at it from a socio-psychological perspective. Is that we tend to think fairly simplistically when we talk about two steps, and there is that. I mean, we have the oops. Well, anyway, I think I had it the reverse, but anyway, you might say you have info creators out here. In other words, Congress people, celebrities, scientists, professors, people that create news, people that you as journalism students might go to interview for a news story. So we'll call them info creators. You're the info mediators. And so you take that information and you may bias it in different ways. We'll talk about different ways that you might bias it. Such as being gatekeepers, so how you select news stories, where you put the news stories in your publications or on your TV presentation, what sources you talk to, what sources don't you talk to, how do you organize your story, what sort of words do you use, what bias words might you use, and so forth. So you have all these people that are mediating, and before it gets to the consumers, info consumers. But what I was interested in was Actually, this was what I was interested in right here, that part. Because some of the research, for example, that shows among the info creators, members of Congress in America, they can predict how that person is going to vote if they can figure out who these people are. They can find out how these people that are socially connected to them, are going to vote. They can predict with over 90% certainty how this guy's going to vote, for example. Now, is that social influence, or is it just that people that think alike become friends? That's a whole other issue. But it does become predictive that your social contacts can predict the results, how you act, like that way. And so I thought, well, that could be applied in the newsroom, for example, the newspaper room that I was, that I was working in. Is can we predict how people within the newsroom will treat the news? And indeed, there is. We'll bring that down here. I put them different sizes depending on the strength of influence that this person had. Let's say this guy's the editor, and that guy's an editor. Two different newspapers. So news organization, News 1 and News 2. This editor is really strong. This one's pretty weak socially. What they found, one of the research in America, they found that if you have a real strong editor that requires you to be objective and fair, that this social relationship is going to dictate that. You're going to write a very, very fair and relatively unbiased story. If you have a weak editor here, so this is applicable to our profession. If you have a weak editor, now the reporters go crazy. The reporters start seeing themselves like knights in the round table, and they're going to go out and destroy people around the world. And once they make that decision, they have that feeling like they are out there to protect the weak and to destroy the strong and so forth, they become very biased in their reporting. They're out of control because they don't have this strong editor saying, no, we don't do that way here. We report both sides of the story, and we do it fairly. We have a lot of very weak editors in America right now, and the reporters are going crazy. Their reporting is not fair and is not unbiased, and that goes for both sides, by the way, not just liberal media. That also goes for conservative. Right now, I don't know if there's any news medium in America that is reporting like I was taught when I was in journalism school, to be fair and unbiased, to the degree possible. Even though we knew that was impossible because of our conceptual framework. We know we can't be totally unbiased, but we can try, and we can try to be fair, try to give both sides a fair hearing, with some exceptions. But the journalists nowadays have made the exceptions the rule. The exceptions like around the time of Nixon, when I was starting my career, Nixon, if you remember him, he was caught up in a scandal. He was a Republican, caught up in a scandal. He ended up leaving the presidency, resigning. And I remember I was in my newsroom at the time, and in those days we didn't have digital wire services. They came in through the wire. That's why we call it wire services. And they go into a big machine, typing all these stories. You had to retype anything you wanted and retype because there was transfer of information. And so I remember that big machine, almost as big as this podium here, and you hear all day, all day long, taking all these stories coming from the press service. But it also had, if it had important news, it might have had a little bell on it. And so it's pretty important, like ding, ding, so you'd go up and you'd see what was going on. Well, the day that Nixon resigned, went ding, 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 ding. And so, and I still remember that. That was a very important time in American history when he finally gave up trying to defend himself and resigned as president. Um, anyway, during that period of time, a lot of the investigative reporters said, and I think rightly, if but should be in very carefully, that if you know somebody did something, you don't let them lie their ways out of it. But you have to know it. You really have to know it. And right now, a lot of stuff that's going on in America is not based on knowledge. It's based on opinion and emotion. And that's one of the biggest problems in journalism in America, and I think it's spreading throughout the world, is that journalism is no longer anywhere close to fair and unbiased in most countries. Now, there are other influences as well, government influences and corporate influences, and we'll talk about those next week. But this is what I was kind of interested in this. How do people around you, there's this idea of groupthink. The idea of groupthink is if you're in a group, a very cohesive group, and everybody starts thinking alike. They maybe didn't start out alike, but they start thinking alike, and they share their opinions with each other and their facts with each other, all the information that they've gathered through selective exposure, selective perception. They gather all these facts and they share them with each other. And if they're Trump haters, for example, they've stacked up all these facts because through selective perception and exposure, they know absolutely that Donald Trump is a dictator, an evil person, all this sort of stuff. Whereas the conservatives, they have stacked up all these other facts. All the things that says the media are dictators and are evil in American democracy. They're telling biased stories all the time, and university professors are evil. They're controlling the universities and so forth. Totally different mindsets. And pretty soon, what groupthink tells us is, pretty soon, if you have a strong group that's reinforcing each other all the time, everything outside of that is nonsense, basically. We've talked about nonsense already. Basically, everything is absurd and nonsense. That's what I'm seeing in America is the conservatives think that for the liberals to think the way they think, they have to be either idiots or evil. There's no other choice. Idiots or evil. And the liberals who think that Trump's evil, they do not understand how in the world anybody can support Trump. And what they think about conservatives, they have to be idiots or evil. One or the other. Both sides think the same thing about the other side. Which, if they suddenly come to the conclusion that indeed evil people are controlling their country, that's where you could have some very serious violence that really scares me. Because I think we're kind of close to that in America. There's other countries where I'm seeing the same thing, particularly in the West. So again, how we associate with people, how we cognitive framework that our conceptual cognitive framework, whatever you want to call it, the way we build that. Our minds are amazing. They're also scary. They're also very fallible. We as journalists need to understand that, I think. And that's part of what we'll talk about this. And this is just kind of the first step in kind of challenging ourselves to think about the nature of our work and the nature possibly of your research, if you're thinking about your research. One of the biggest challenges that we face in our industry right now is the polarization, the cognitive framework that's being developed, depending on where somebody's at. A lot of it's being developed, I think, in the universities. The kids don't think like their parents do at all, hardly anymore. They get some basis there, but university professors, in some universities, there's more than 14 liberal professors for every one conservative professor in some universities in America. And so students go in there and they are, you could use the word brainwash. They had only one perspective taught to them. in that university. And they don't understand the nature of their conceptual framework and why it is that maybe they should double check themselves a little bit. Why maybe what they're thinking as taught to them by their professors may not be absolutely true, because they're getting such a big boatload of it, and nobody's challenging it. And like I said, they even, when a conservative tries to go on campus, they will literally riot to stop them from talking, which is bizarre. That's totally anti-liberal. The whole idea of liberality is to listen to lots of ideas and to be open to, ponder and to think and to challenge yourself and so forth, not to be weighed down by biases and prejudices. And that's not what we're seeing there anymore. And so it's scary. And it's not just, again, it's not just a problem. I think the group think we see going on both sides, conservative and liberal. But the liberals just happen to control some of the main institutions: Hollywood, journalism, and universities. They control those three. Okay, we're way past time. Sorry to keep you. Um, I'm going to put some videos on the internet. Please look for those. That's your homework. Will be to watch some videos. I have them in this PowerPoint, but anyway, they will challenge your thinking. One of them is by a liberal journalist, Pulitzer Prize winning editor from Newsday, and he gives quite a long one. And then I'll give you for this week, uh, probably a couple of shorter ones by people who would disagree with him on certain important areas. But even what he says is very interesting. He actually, some of what I said today, I took from his talk. So what he talks about is enlightening, but I would say it's biased to the left, liberally. Um, but and so I will challenge some of his statements with a couple of other short videos to get you thinking how these things influence us in our industry of communications. Okay, well, thank you. If you have any questions, oh yes. Yeah, you signed up in Moodle. Let me double check here. Let me actually go to the Moodle to make sure. Yeah, that's correct. Understanding 2019 is the key word to get into to sign up for Moodle. Please do that. Like I said, next week we'll have a quiz at the end of class. So I probably won't. I mean, I'll definitely cover some of the stuff I talked about today, but it won't be real picky detail. Certainly some of the general concepts today, and then whatever I cover next week. So do sign up for that. Bring something. We had today just to make sure another class and the interviewing class. There wasn't any problem with people accessing the quizzes on their mobile devices or other laptops or whatever. So bring something with which you can access Moodle to do a quick quiz at the end of the class. Okay. You got another question that I didn't find over here? Any question, anybody? I'm going to go over that next week. Yeah, she's asking about how you're going to be graded in the class, and I told you one of them, the quizzes, but I'm trying to fine tune the other still, so I will have to go over those with you next week. So we'll go with that. Any other questions? we were required to have a final exam. We sign up, we sign in, we do a final exam for sure. So where the final exam for the 50% or 40% whatever it is, I have to be differentiate you. And so if you all get, I'll get, answer all of the executive questions correct, I gotta distinguish you from questions. That's just the way they're pushing us now in academic affairs. You probably already know, I can only give 25% A's in the class, A's and A minuses. I hate that. I think it's stupid. I think it's not a business. Another thing I can talk with the university about, but I have challenged them on that, and they kick it back and make me redo it. So you can expect a final exam and then a lot of objective questions, but also academic questions related to stuff we're talking about. And we'll think about the stuff, take some notes. But other than that, then one thing I guess I will say, one thing I want to do, and I need to check out to make sure it's okay, is I have access now from an organization called Investigative Reporters and Editors. In America, they give regular workshops and they record them. And I'm thinking I want everybody to do a kind of a, well, first off, a PowerPoint and a video on one of those workshops. And so I don't know if I'm going to have to download however many students we have here. So I want you all to do something different. I want to have that access to all of that. I want somebody to analyze one of those workshops, create a PowerPoint, even take some video from the workshop. We'll go over how to do that. And so we don't know how to do that. We'll have you make a little video based on your PowerPoint of what they talked about in the workshop and actually some clips from their workshop. So we'll go to the, that's one of the more practical things. Investigative journalism from these professionals, these top professionals that present at their annual or twice annual whatever conferences they have. And I want to tap into that knowledge base. I think good for you and good for me too, as far as that goes. I want to make that knowledge base available to all students here. So that's a way of learning some things, some insights that you may not have now. And then your videos will be provided, some of them will be required of students, some of them will just be available on Google for you to go through or watch if you want to. That'll be one of your main assignments in class. There'll be some, I'll have you grab something as well.